If a victim doesn't understand or can't recall or recalls things differently, it doesn't mean that person is lying. It's because trauma has had an impact. A smell may be something that's very powerful for them, but they can't remember what color clothing a person was wearing. There's a million things that trauma does, unfortunately, to the brain and the body. Another huge thing, why didn't the person fight back? Well, because tonic immobility. Oftentimes the trauma response shuts you down.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with me on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 85. And this week, I've invited a former work colleague to join me, Roger Canaff. Roger was hired by the U.S. Army around the same time I was to be a highly qualified expert, HQE, to help the Army lower the number of sexual assault perpetrators within the ranks. While I was hired by the Criminal Investigative Command, CID, Roger was hired by the JAG Corps due to his expertise as a former sexual assault prosecutor. I brought Roger into the teaching ranks of the Special Victims Unit Investigations course, where he helped teach in numerous iterations of the 2-week course I co-managed. Roger and I formed a friendship that continues to this day, and I wanted you to hear from him regarding his perspectives on sexual assault investigation and prosecution. So let's get to it. Here's Roger. Roger Canaff, it is so good to have you here on the show with me. Thank you for being my guest this week.
Thank you, Dave, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And for my audience, just so you know, Roger and I go pretty far back. I met Roger when I was hired as a highly qualified expert for the Army and utilized Roger and his instruction and his experience as a prosecutor in sex assault cases when I was helping to co-manage the sex assault investigations course at Fort Leonard Wood. Roger contributed to the educational end of things, and that's why I invited him here, is to bring us up to date on what he's doing now and what his perspectives are. Roger, if you don't mind, tell my audience about yourself.
Sure. My name is Roger Canaff. As Dave said, I'm grateful to be here. I was a special victims prosecutor for most of my career. I did suffer chronic sexual abuse as a child. The only reason I say that is because it is a part of my history. It's a part of who I am. And I've been public about it for about 20 years. It's never something I was ashamed of. Obviously, it's something that I was confused by, like anybody else would be. The interesting thing is that on the heels of saying that I'm a child sexual abuse survivor, on the very heels of that, I always say, because this is the truth, I actually don't feel that drove me or led me into special victims work. There may be an army of psychiatrists that would disagree with me and say, well, you may not think that, but it actually did. And that's very possible, of course. It really is. But I honestly believe that I had resolved most of that stuff before I got into professional work. I had a continued therapy journey, and it's still not over, really. Although that's a part of my past, I don't know that it affected my professional life. In fact, I'm glad it didn't, because if I had been a survivor and I had been holding on to all that angst, I don't think I could have done the job as well as I did. I think I was very successful with it. I was very good with women and children, with boys too, but I tend to have a strong aminus, sort of a strong feminine side. A lot of people say that. I think all those things just sort of helped me. And I did have some, I guess, probably some increased empathy because of my own experiences. But it's important, I think, for the listener to know that my personal experiences really were separate from my professional experience. And they had to be. And I'm glad they were. So it worked out well. But I did get to do what I wanted. I was very blessed. I went to law school in North Carolina. I got the job I wanted where I wanted, which was the city of Alexandria, which is a beautiful colonial historical town just south of Washington, D.C. I began to prosecute child sexual abuse, sexual assaults, crimes against persons with disabilities, and also domestic violence, what we now call IPV, interpersonal violence. So that's where I specialize. So basically, special victims is where I gravitate toward, and that's what I got to do. I did that in Alexandria for almost 7 years, moved on to the National District Attorneys Association, and I was doing full-time training and consulting with them and their child abuse unit. From there, I went back to the courtroom. I was in the Bronx, New York. For 2 years, I was a senior line prosecutor in their child abuse and sex unit. Also a really, really interesting experience, marvelous place, good people. I was only there a couple of years. I went in, I became the deputy chief of the newly formed Sex Offender Civil Management Unit under the New York State Attorney General's office. What that unit does is people who are coming out of prison for sexual crimes, if it is believed that they are still presented danger to themselves or others because of a legal term, sexual abnormality, then we can litigate and keep them under state supervision or even in psychiatric care. It's a controversial law. About 20 states do it. New York set out to do it, and it was brand new, and I got hired on to help manage the unit and set it up. Best job I ever had, probably. It was marvelous. So I did that for another 2 years, and then finally, this is around the time that I met you, Dave. In 2009, I took a position as a HQE, or highly qualified expert, with the United States Army. So I was an Army civilian embedded in the JAG Corps, and I was there for about 2.5 years, training and consulting. I was doing training with Judge Advocates General and consulting on courts martial and things like that. Again, for the same type of stuff, mostly sexual assault within the ranks, because that's what I was brought on to do. Yeah. We also saw child abuse cases, child sex abuse cases, and other things. Yeah. That's it. That's the path of the career. And peppered with that and interspersed with it over the last 25 years, I've done training and consulting in 49 states, several countries, and, just for all sorts of organizations over time.
Right. I'm going to concur with you. I don't think my sexual assault experience as a child had a whole lot to do with me becoming a cop. But like you said, I think there are probably a lot of psychologists who would argue that, yeah, it's exactly what you did. And I can kind of see that perspective, that maybe I got into it as a response to wanting to have some control over my life and having some authority. But also the experience, I think, made me an empath. I can really relate to victims, child victims, adult victims. And that ended up being my forte. So when the Army knocked on my door and said, hey, well, you can be an HQE in the investigations part of it and help us develop some of the training curriculum, I jumped on it. It was an amazing experience, a tough learning curve because I'd never been in the military. But I think I understand exactly what you're saying when you talk about your experience not having a whole lot to do with why you became an attorney, but the empath part of it having a great deal of impact then on maybe how you approach these cases.
Yes, I do believe that. And I appreciate you saying that. I mean, if I may say so, I think you are an empath. I've always sort of absorbed that from you. And I do think that we had that in common. It's impossible for those experiences to not have affect us. And I think, thankfully, with regard to our jobs, I think they did affect us in a positive way, in that we could relate perhaps better than somebody who hadn't had those experiences.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to talk about that experience that you had as a prosecutor and compare what was going on in those years pre-Army to what you see now. You're still consulting. You may not be prosecuting anymore, but you're still consulting in this field. I know you keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on with other colleagues, and you read and stay up on what's happening with regard to how these cases are being approached and prosecuted. Do you see a difference now in prosecution success rate and the attitudes of prosecutors than what you experienced when you were in the field?
Yeah, I think in general, things are getting better. It's one of those things. Dr. King said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I really do believe that. When I started in the late 90s, there was a lot of eagerness out there to understand the issues, but there was still a lag in terms of the training. And I think we really have done a very good job, all of us collectively, in law enforcement, in prosecution, in advocacy, in the medical response. I think we've all done a pretty good job catching each other up over the past 25 years or so, at least in terms of my perspective. So I do think there's been an improvement. One area where I think there's been undeniable improvement is underserved populations, individuals who identify as gay and lesbian, individuals who are trans, individuals who are marginalized for whatever other reason. They're, experiencing homelessness or whatever it is. I think we're much better at serving underserved populations. But I think we're getting much better at that much more quickly than we used to. I think, again, in the late 90s, by that time, popular culture had shifted. And I do think there were quite a few people who understood that rape is not what people envisioned it. It's a masked guy that jumps a woman in a parking lot and she doesn't have any blemishes on her record. Rape is much, much different than that. The vast majority of people who experience it from people they know, all of those things. I think by the time I came into the business, there was much greater understanding of the reality of sexual violence. And that's good. And I think that has continued. What I think we have done to improve over my time is that we're much better at addressing the underserved population. So I think that's the area that we should be most proud of. we're much more willing in law enforcement training, prosecution training. Advocates are much more vocal about this. We're hearing much more about these underserved populations than we did before. And I think that's probably our greatest achievement over the last few decades.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, although I can see a lot of room for improvement. The marginalized communities are still suffering. And I think the statistics now are so much different than they were than the era that you're talking about, the late 90s, even the early 2000s, when we really had no concept, because there hadn't been a lot of research about what the impact was on the LGBTQ community, for example, and how rampant sexual assault and rape is within that community. And then when somebody were to report it, it was just ignored, not fought for very enthusiastically. Mm-hmm. So I think what you're saying is spot on. And I do see some amazing changes in that regard. And it's part of why this show exists, is to advocate for more of those types of changes and to bring that marginalized community into focus with the population as a whole. Because I see another shortcoming with regard to sex assault and rape in general. And that is that until recently, we weren't very educated or informed on the impact of trauma. And that was something that we tried to do early on in the early 2000s with the program in the Army, is to educate people on what trauma does to the brain and people's lives. Did you have much experience with seeing some of that impact, both as a prosecutor and then later on as a consultant, and how becoming trauma-informed was a help, or is it a hindrance?
It's definitely not a hindrance. Understanding trauma response is a wonderful thing. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because now that I'm thinking about it, that too, the real understanding of trauma response, how trauma affects the brain, how it affects memory and recall, those things really weren't well understood, or at least they weren't well publicized in the anti-sexual violence community, at least certainly not within, in my experience, not within prosecution and law enforcement. So I think, like I was saying before, by the late 90s, we were more empathic. We were more willing to understand sexual violence looks different from what we have been led to believe over time. Victims look different. The nature of the crime is different, all those things. So I think we were ahead of the game, but I didn't really see trauma response being put into effect until much, much later. And I agree, around the time that I was working for the Army, the research had been much more publicized, and thankfully utilize it in understanding, hey, if a victim doesn't understand or can't recall or recalls things differently, it doesn't mean that person is lying. It's because trauma has had an impact. A smell may be something that's very powerful for them, but they can't remember what color of clothing a person was wearing. There's a million things that trauma does, unfortunately, to the brain and the body. Another huge thing, why didn't the person fight back? Well, because tonic immobility. Oftentimes the trauma response shuts you down. Those are things, in my experience, we didn't really come to understand until the late 2000s, I want to say, like 2008, 2009. I do think there were some great cops and good prosecutors who anticipated this. Even without the research, I think they sort of understood, okay, it sounds like this person froze. It sounds like this person can't remember because they were focusing on something else. So I think there were plenty of people out there that had an understanding of this stuff and were folding it into their practice. But I don't think it was anywhere near as universal as it is now until 15 or so years ago, even less.
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, I can remember even in 2009, 2010, when I first started becoming aware of the depth of knowledge with regard to being trauma-informed and how it affects the memory. I remember thinking back, man, I wish I'd known this stuff when I was investigating these cases. It would have changed the complexion of so many of the cases that I investigated, not only in how I investigated them, but how they were turned over to the DA's office for prosecution. And I think with enough education and passion that we see now with so many investigators, so many prosecutors who are becoming that much more educated in the trauma-informed response and what the neurobiology of the brain is with regard to those trauma impacts, that a lot more of these cases are making it to the courtroom, but also a lot more of them are being successfully prosecuted with convictions. Do you see that also?
I think it's absolutely true. In fact, some really high-profile cases have reflected that. Harvey Weinstein is an example. In fact, being trauma-informed and understanding trauma effects was a big part of why that case was successful. And again, you could argue as to whether or not the prosecution tried to bring in other things and did too much, but the idea of being trauma informed and understanding how trauma affects the mind and the body was very important for the prosecution in that case, because the victims often acted in ways that could be perceived as counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And by the way, we haven't said this yet. That's what being trauma informed is about. It's about understanding what we have called counterintuitive behaviors. And again, just like much of society viewed rape in one way, it's usually a stranger. It's usually a violent attack. Just like we misunderstood that, we also misunderstood victim reactions for decades. A real victim's going to fight back tooth and nail. A real victim is going to immediately report. A real victim, this is a horrible event. Of course, she's going to remember every single second of it. All those things we understand are wrong. Mm-hmm. And now that we know those things, yes, I don't only think it's out there in the literature and in training, I do think it's being reflected in the cases now. So I am glad to see that. Like you said, still a lot of work to go, but I do think that's getting better.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's part of what was helpful in the Crosby case and in the Nassar case and in so many others that we could sit here and name, is the idea of becoming trauma informed to the point where that counterintuitive reaction that we used to look at as a detriment to the victim's response is now being explained as, of course, that's what trauma does. You know, one of the things too, Roger, and maybe you can talk to this too based on some of your experience, is how important it is to help victims become trauma informed so that they understand some of what they've been through and have some answers for themselves about why they have intrusive memories, about why these horrific nightmares keep coming into their sleep, and how they respond in very unexpected ways to intrusive thought patterns or smells and tastes or sounds like you just mentioned. Is it helpful for victims, in your viewpoint, to have that trauma-informed knowledge for themselves?
It's marvelously helpful. And here's the thing to remember, and I think it's important for us in law enforcement to understand this, and prosecution and policing in particular. Not every case is prosecutable, and not every case is going to have a successful response in terms of the criminal law. But that doesn't mean the case is invaluable. Healing is the most important thing, right? Everybody can agree on that. Everything that we do now survivor-centered or victim-centered, depending on the term that you're comfortable with. When we adopt that, and if we're serious about being victim-centered, then what we mean is what's best for the victim is most important here. For some victims, prosecution may not be the best response. For some cases, prosecution won't be a practical response. In other words, there's evidence here. We believe this person. We're not doubting that the person suffered this, but the kind of evidence that's required under our system, which is pretty blunt, very old system. It's built on Judeo-Christian principles of right and wrong. Those are not bad things. And built into that is this requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a very clunky system. The system of policing and prosecuting and punishing, it's not a bad system innately. It's an important system. It's all we have, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. Every person who has experienced sexual violence, not only is it important for every person to understand these responses, because they'll be easier on themselves. They won't question why they didn't fight back. They won't question why they reacted in a certain way. And hopefully they won't question why, just like you said, that these same emotions and responses begin to cascade down when they reflect on that trauma. Yeah. They can't remember it without reliving it. There are solid psychological reasons for all of these things, and I think it's fantastic for victims to know that. Yeah. What I'm saying in addition is it's also important because if we, as law enforcement, as cops and prosecutors in particular, if we come across a case where we empathize with the victim, we understand, but we feel that the system won't bear this out, meaning the criminal justice system, that does not mean that the victim should not feel believed, that the victim should not feel supported, and that healing should take place. So I guess what I'm trying to say is everybody understanding that, I think, makes it a little easier. I had plenty of cases that I lost, meaning I did not obtain any conviction. And I had some cases where I had to decline simply because it's not that I didn't believe the individual, it's that the evidence wasn't there. But just because the system can't digest something and process it doesn't mean that healing can't happen. And that's really the most important thing.
I agree. That's so important. I'm so glad you said that. The portion of my audience that is law enforcement based, which is, again, a big reason why I wanted you here, Roger, because I think so much of what you have to say is not only relevant to victims and survivors, but to that criminal justice field. The ripple effect is enormous. I want people to hear it from someone other than just me. Thank you for all those comments.
Yeah. The other thing I think we have to understand is that as we encourage more and more people to come forward who have experienced sexual violence, It's kind of like, if you build it, they will come. If we are encouraging, and we should be, if we're encouraging individuals to come forward and to report, every victim should be met with belief, at least at the beginning, with empathy, with how can I make you feel safe? The only thing I would say about that is that all of those things, as people feel more emboldened to say, hey, this happened to me. It was 20 years ago. It was 15 years ago. Or I didn't do anything, but it really scared me. We can still help those individuals to heal. We can still respect what they went through. We can still validate their feelings. We can still respond in a decent way and allow healing to begin, which is really the thing that we need to do over anything anyway.
So spot on. I'm appreciative of all those comments. What impact do you see came from and is coming from, and where do you see the Me Too movement going?
Well, I think the Me Too movement was an expression of anger that needed to happen. And I'm glad that it did. I think it was sort of tamped down. I think there were mostly women who had been experiencing anywhere from subtle to severe, anywhere from annoying to criminal, sexual inappropriateness or sexual, or, all the way through sexual violence. I think millions and millions of women who experienced that had just been quiet about it for a really, really, really long time. And there was a bit of a dam breaking, I think. And I guess the initial Weinstein cases seem to have brought that around in around, I want to say 2017 or so. For the most part, I think it's been great. I think it's really important for any kind of a universally shared experience like that to come through and penetrate and get into popular culture. It needs to be. Like any other benevolent social movement, it's going to go to the margins. You're going to get the occasional cynical person that gets involved and wants to exploit it. You're going to get the occasional person who's just kind of out there, even though they're sincere, and that maybe they're putting forward something under the Me Too banner that just isn't helpful. Like all men are horrible or all women are horrible or something, those kind of statements are just not helpful. Yeah. So every good movement is going to have to go through the margins. It's going to have to go through it's going to have to filter out some stuff that's not helpful. But for the most part, I think it's been really solid. I think it's freed people from feeling like they couldn't discuss that kind of stuff anymore. I think it has probably led to the improvement of mostly male behavior in a lot of spaces. And again, that too can create a backlash. That can go too far. There are men out there who are, I can't say somebody's dress is nice or something like that. Yeah, sure. There are the occasional instances where what good intentions carry things too far and they end up creating anger and creating a backlash. It needs to settle out. But in general, I think it's a very good thing. I think it's a very good thing that mostly women are expressing themselves and saying, I shouldn't have had to deal with this, whether it was violent or whether it was just annoying. It's not something I should have had to put up with because of who I am and how I identify.
Yeah. Roger, do you look back on your Army experience as a beneficial time? I know that there's been some recent comments that have been made from some of the top brass in the military who said, sadly, the needle hasn't moved in terms of sex assault within the ranks. We're not fixing much. What's your take on your time with the Army in terms of how what you were doing and how myself and some of the other HQEs were trying to do impacted the military? Do you think it was worthwhile? And do you see some improvement on the horizon?
It's a fair question. I definitely think the HQE program was a good idea. And I definitely think the HQEs, myself and the other individuals, I do think they've made a difference. Now, I've been out of the Army civilian environment now for 12 years, but I absolutely feel that the program has helped infuse JAGs, advocates in the military environment in general with some of these things that we're talking about. I do think it's been a net positive. Whether or not it has moved the needle, I think we have to be patient with that. Goalposts are always going to be moving. Things are always going to be changing. How can we retell that life is better in the military than it was for individuals when it comes to sexual violence? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe it is significantly better. Maybe it's not. But in any event, I think it can take a really, really long time for the effects of any program to be felt. I had a tough time in the military, not because of the military or because of the environment. I loved it. I met wonderful people. Yeah. I clashed a little bit with some of the sort of the immediate management in terms of what my mission was. It wasn't always well defined. And even among the HQEs, we had different visions. There were a couple of HQEs who really saw themselves as trial consultants, like I'm here to help win cases. There were others like myself who sort of looked at it a little bit more universally and kind of thought, let me impact the culture. But when you try to impact the culture, you can make a lot of people uncomfortable. Yeah. The top people that I dealt with, the general officers that I dealt with within the JAG Corps, were very responsive to all of this stuff. Like, absolutely, we need to change this. We need to find out what's going on. it's a tough process. Not to mention the fact that general officers have a tremendous amount of other responsibilities.
Yeah.
We were there. It was technically wartime. It was a very difficult time, I think, to be there. But I don't regret it at all. I'm very, very glad that I did it. And I'll tell you, I think for most civilians, most people who don't go into the military, I think there's something really valuable and important about understanding what military life is like. Many, many civilians don't understand it. A lot of people assume they do because of popular culture or movies or television or books. And I don't claim to understand it because I didn't actually put on a uniform. But to be embedded with the military and to see what it is that they deal with and the sacrifices they make, I think it's important for anybody to do. Yeah. But getting back to your initial question, I certainly don't think that HQE was a bad idea or that it should be abandoned. It has to be a long game. It's going to be a really, really long process before I think we sort of see the needle move. A lot of this stuff just has to come down through the culture, individual to individual. And I do think that we are seeing that happen, but I think we have to be patient with it.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. I put a lot of weight behind what you're saying because as you were talking, it resonated with me in the sense that I felt the same way. It was somewhat of a culture shock for me, but at the same time, it was super educational and I felt like I was contributing. I still get comments from some of those soldiers that I worked with and that attended the 2-week course that I helped manage, that it was impactful and that was helpful. And you were a big part of that. And so thank you for doing that. But also I appreciate your perspective on the fact that, yeah, change takes time, especially in a huge organization like the military.
And it's understandable. I think so many people sort of say, okay, and I think even a lot of military leaders will say, well, we know what the right thing is to do. Why can't we just go there? And like you say, it's a thing that just turns slowly. It's why we really do have to be patient with it. Some of the people that I started with are still there, and remarkable women that I started with, HQEs that are, the position has shifted now from HQE to a more permanent position embedded within federal civil service and the JAG Corps. But I think they're doing great work and they're informing. I think they're assisting with prosecutions. The other part, I guess, of the equation is, well, I mentioned it a little before, is how is this measured? How are we measuring quality of life? How are we measuring incidents of violence and things like that? It's always going to be tough to know. It's always going to be difficult to figure that out. It's disconcerting for me to hear that, yeah, there are military leaders who are saying this is frustrating because we've been at this for about 20 years now. I think it was right around 2004, I think, that Congress began to put pressure on the services. You got to do something about this. And, the Army's iteration was the HQE program a couple of years later.
Exactly.
But it's very, very hard, I think, to measure it. It's almost like anecdotal experiences seem to make more sense. Just like you said, there are people who remember the trainings, people who remember being responded to in a different way. I think that has a lot more value sometimes than raw numbers.
I get that. What's in the future for you? You said you're still doing some training, you're still doing some consulting, keeping your thumb on the pulse.
My focus, I write fiction. It's a hobby that's turned into a job in a way. I had a book deal a couple of years ago that went really well, and I'm continuing on, hopefully with that same publisher. But I write legal thrillers, and I absolutely write them all from the perspective of not only a person who survived sexual abuse, but a person who prosecuted it. And that's probably going to be my passion year on out.
Yeah.
I have absolutely loved being a part of this movement.
Well, Roger, thank you. This has been extremely informative and insightful and helpful. I know my audience, as well as myself, have gained something from having you as a guest. I appreciate the time you took and being with us this afternoon, and I hope we can stay in touch and keep these conversations going.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate it.
You're a big mentor in my life, and maybe you didn't know it. Just watching you, listening to you teach, and seeing what you've done and hearing from you even now has been an extreme help. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate it. Let me know if I can assist further, man. And please keep in touch. I will definitely keep a channel.
I would love that. I think we need to keep in better touch, you and I.
All right, man. Well, listen, have a fantastic week.
You do the same. Thanks for doing this. It's been a wonderful.
I don't mind at all. As long as I can add value, I was happy.
I appreciate it.
All right, man. Take care.
Right. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to give a huge shout out to Roger Canaff for taking the time to be my guest this week and for his insightful and helpful perspectives on being trauma-informed and his take on the current status of sexual assault prosecutions. Thank you, Roger. It was a tremendous benefit to have you on the show with me. And for those of you who are listening, thank you for being here. I appreciate that you are part of the SAS audience. I want to again ask you that you share this episode and the podcast as a whole with everyone you know. I have a goal to increase the listenership of this podcast by 500 people a week. And that's certainly possible if you'll do your part in sharing the episodes you listen to. Just click on the share icon and send episodes to family, friends, and colleagues. Everyone can benefit from listening to this show, and it will help bring justice to the victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Another way to do this is to start by believing when it comes to listening to and providing support for victims and survivors, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Thank you for your loyalty and your support in helping this podcast grow. We'll see you next week.